Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, as usual, it is indeed a privilege and an honor to be allowed to contribute in this House. Today, I've joined this debate to add the contribution from a national security perspective and as Minister of National Security to the Anti-Gang Act 2021, which is currently before the Senate. On the last occasion, a week ago, there was robust debate, valid contributions by those in this House. I'd like to start, Madam President, by putting on the record something that I have said repeatedly, and it's worth repeating as I begin today's contribution. From a national security point of view, and without fear of contradiction, this legislation is absolutely necessary. In fact, I was pleased to see as I was perusing the Hansard of last week's contributions that Senator Richards literally started his contribution by saying, and I quote, "It is untenable in 2021 that any country not have anti-gang legislation." And I join with him in that submission. Madam President, we cannot and should not bury our heads in the sand. Gangs are very real. Gangs have been operating in Trinidad and Tobago, and gangs operate globally for many, many decades. I saw previous contributors refer to a specific point in our nation's history, 1990. Respectfully, gangs began even before then. Gangs have always been around from time immemorial. But what we are facing today, and this is about the third or the fourth time I've come to the Senate, Madam President, to contribute towards anti-gang bills and anti-gang legislation. Unfortunately, on previous occasions, both here and in the other place, we failed to reach and obtain the support for legislation that had more teeth than the piece of legislation that's currently before the Senate here today. I also caught the contribution of Senator Vera, a seasoned practitioner in the courts, person with a lot of experience when it comes to legislation and, more importantly, the application of legislation. And again, I was pleased to listen and to hear the sentiment that the legislation, anti-gang legislation, is necessary. Temporary Senator John Heath, a practitioner in the criminal courts, also joined that cry and that call. Madam Speaker, any citizen of Trinidad and Tobago who is serious and who is following what goes on knows that we are fighting a scourge of criminal gang activity. And that's what this legislation here today is to deal with, criminal gangs. And quite usefully, the first schedule sets out, and I'll get into it in a short while, some of the areas that we have found in national security criminal gang networks are operating. No jurisdiction in the world that is facing the scourge of criminal gang activity is without specific anti-gang legislation. The gangs that operate in and around Trinidad and Tobago are real, and I'll get into some of the activity they're engaged in today. We know them in certain acronyms, and there's certain larger gangs that operate, but every single area, unfortunately, is penetrated by some criminal gang activity. You have the Muslim gang fraction. You have the Rasta City gang fraction. We have had spin-offs of that into gangs called Six, as I saw Senator Richards refer to, also another gang, the Anybody Gets It gang, ABG. These are some of the bigger umbrella groups, and in those groups there's splinter gangs all over. And any law enforcement officer will tell you that gang legislation, anti-gang legislation, is an absolutely necessary tool in their arsenal of fighting criminal gang activity. No one has suggested, because it would be insane to suggest that there's any one piece of legislation that's going to solve criminal gang activity. However, to say not to have the passage of this, in my view, somewhat watered-down piece of legislation, but necessary piece of legislation, is to prevent the police service from having a fighting chance in specifically targeting gangs. One of the misleading comments that I've heard repeated time and time again, and unfortunately was repeated last week again, is to those who haven't read the bill, a suggestion that gang-related activity is covered in all other areas of the criminal law of Trinidad and Tobago. That is one small fragment of what this legislation is about. Madam President, when you look at the legislation, as I will do now, you see the very specific offenses created by this legislation, created and only existing in this legislation, and all of those offenses are specifically targeted at the scourge that is criminal gang activity. And for those in the public out there, and for those in this Senate who may not be aware, who may not be affected, who may be fortunate enough not to have the information and to see the reality of the scourges of gang activity and the consequences of gang activity, I'd like to just put that into some sort of context. I saw yesterday, reported in today's newspaper and in the media, that a Joint Select Committee on National Security of the Parliament touched on gang activity in one of the areas. Senator Richards referred to it in his contribution last week, which is the prison system. There is no part of our society that is not touched by the criminal gang activity. And this piece of legislation, respectively, Madam President, is absolutely necessary. I cannot emphasize that enough in dealing with the specifics of gangs and just adding a tool in the arsenal of tools necessary for law enforcement. There were certain contributors last week, and I assume there may be some today as well, that are asking for sunset clause. Respectfully, we have gone past that. We have gone past this sunset clause. You look at how we have dealt with gangs in Los Angeles, gangs in New York, the scourge of gang activity in Chicago, gangs in the United Kingdom, gangs in Canada, all of these jurisdictions in Australia, all touched by gang activity. You need to have specific anti-gang legislation, and to continue to say, put a sunset clause, let's come back in 2 years and measure it. I will also touch on how long it takes for a successful criminal gang investigation to gel and come together, for the evidence to then be produced, for it to then result in charges. And I will also get into this moving goalposts that I see. Well, tell us how many convictions there are under the anti-gang legislation. That's a completely false argument and premise within to measure this, because we as legislators can only pass legislation. The executive can only provide the tools and the resources. The police service, as part of the executive area of government falling under them, can only do the investigations, lay the charges. It then hits the criminal court justice system. There are areas in the criminal court justice system that are protected by the separations of power principle. The judiciary is protected. There is separation of powers. They're insulated. It is a court that must hear, try, look over the trial and take it towards either a conviction or an acquittal. It is a director of public prosecutions who, under the Constitution, is again ring-fenced and protected. Him and the police will lead the prosecution. It is the lawyers at the criminal bar, and they get upset every time reference is made to them. But they also have a responsibility. Those are the three areas that have a responsibility for securing either a conviction or an acquittal. So to say that legislation has failed is a completely false premised argument and has absolutely no merit in my respectful submission. So just to jump into the composition of the gangs in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, the gangs that are currently in Trinidad and Tobago, like other areas of the world, are very sophisticated. They are operating sometimes at an advantage, because criminal activity always has the advantage of knowing what it is they're going to do And the state, in its response or in trying to be proactive, has to either try to predict it, try to intercept it, or try to deal with it. Unfortunately, sometimes that happens retroactively in the vast majority of times, especially when dealing with gangs. Our gangs are sophisticated, and we need to provide law enforcement, Madam President, with various tools to combat criminal gangs, and that includes this legislation. Gangs and gang leaders are structured and not sophisticated. The police service, along with the intelligence services, have been targeting the criminal gangs. And even in this debate, and when speaking about it from a national security perspective, I must be cautious not to alert them. I saw in somebody's contribution, they said, they will be looking on, and that is true. Anyone who believes that the criminal gangs that are operating are not sophisticated and they don't have specific, very educated persons in their structures are completely wrong. We have found through intelligence that they're persons with masters in business administration, masters in international relations, etc., who are part of these sophisticated gang setups because the leaders need the advice. They have their legal advisors. They have their financial advisors. How do you tackle and dismantle these sophisticated gangs? You need specific legislation. And to jump straight into it, Madam President, when you look at this act, it is completely wrong and misleading, in my respectful submission, to suggest there's no need for this specific anti-gang bill and to say gang-related activity is captured, and that's really the schedule in other areas of the law. So to start, the second part of this bill, offenses, part 2. Part 2, every single offense in here, clauses 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, and 13, are all unique to this law. All are specifically designed to target gangs. And through you, Madam President, just to let the public know, the first one is Clause 5, gang membership. There is no other piece of legislation that exists, no matter how the opposition tries to spin it, here and elsewhere, that captures gang membership. So Clause 5, the first offense is a person who is a gang leader, is a gang member, performs an act as a condition for membership in a gang, professes to be a gang leader or a gang member in order to gain a benefit for himself or another person, intimidate other persons, or promote a gang, commits an offense. That does not exist anywhere else in the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. How can we be serious as a nation that is facing the criminal elements and not have that in this day and age as a specific offense? Clause 6 of this bill, coercing or encouraging gang membership. Again, specifically designed to target one of the pillars of criminal gang activity. Any person who coerces, encourages, entices, aids, or abets another person to be a gang leader or a gang member commits an offense. So we're criminalizing what happens in reality. It does not exist in any other piece of legislation. Clause 7, retaliatory action. So in other words, a person who intentionally takes any retaliatory action against another person or any of that other person's relatives, friends, associates, or properties on account of that person refusing to be a gang member or gang leader, ceasing to be a gang leader or gang member. So persons who are trying to get out, if they are then targeted by others, we have now created a specific offense to allow persons the ability to exit gangs. That is how serious it is. Again, that is in no other piece of legislation. So the continual cry and shout and scream, there's no need for anti-gang legislation because it's covered by other areas, is completely false. And it goes on to capture another things, assisting investigation of gangs, giving evidence in the prosecution of gangs. Anybody who takes action against those persons, we're now creating a specific offense, Madam President. Clause 8, counseling a gang. Any person who knowingly counsels, gives instructions or guidance to, finances, otherwise provides support to a gang leader or gang member, we're criminalizing that. These offenses are very specific to what takes place in the reality of a gang world and a gang culture. It is so sophisticated now, the leaders themselves don't do it. The leaders themselves will not have the illegal firearms on them, the drugs on them. They will pass that down the chain of command. The leaders of gangs in this day and age move in convoys. They are moving in convoys, more sophisticated at times than some of the state convoys that are present. This is the reality of what is taking place. The reality of what is taking place across the country, unfortunately, is there sections of criminality, and this is why this legislation has been brought here once again. Unfortunately, some provisions taken out, but necessary, because law enforcement needs it. Clause 9, preventing a gang leader or gang member from leaving a gang, a specific offense. It exists nowhere else in the law. Clause 11, harboring a gang member. Clause 12, concealing a gang member or gang leader. I challenge anyone, inside or outside, to tell the population where else in the law these specific offenses can be found. And every single offense I've referred to is specifically targeted at going at the heart of criminal gangs. Will it overnight, when it's passed, prevent the reoccurrence of gang activity? Absolutely not. But what it does now, it gives the law enforcement officers who are investigating it specific offenses within which to target the gang activity. Clause 13, a person who recruits another person to a gang commits an offense. Again, specific. And it goes on. Those are the specific offenses created by this legislation. The reference to a definition of gang-related activity being covered by other legislation is completely misleading. And it is being done to try and mislead the population that don't worry, you don't need this anti-gang legislation because that criminal activity is caught elsewhere. Let's look at the first schedule, Madam President. And I'd just like to draw the public's attention to just a few of the examples under this schedule and to show how it is related and captured by gang activity. But yes, it can exist independently. Nobody is saying no. But the specific offenses created by this legislation are not found anywhere else. The police powers that are being granted here, and that is the area where, as a government, we had to look at it and take out some of what existed before to bring it as a simple majority bill. The gang-related activity offenses in the first schedule, and these are the ones I want to draw to the public's attention in the limited time I have today, Madam President. 13 and 14, threatening to publish with intent to extort, and 14, demanding money with menaces. This is real in Trinidad and Tobago. Extortion is taking place. We are all aware that when certain contracts are being executed, criminal gangs very often go to the sites and threaten the contractor, threaten the workers that unless they are given the ability to have some participation in the contract, all hell will break loose. This ties right into that type of activity, giving law enforcement now an ability, because it is something we've been trying to target. And it is a difficulty because persons are afraid to come forward, and that is why you've also seen other pieces of legislation being passed, other pieces of the puzzle being put together, also under this: rape, grievous sexual assault, kidnapping, kidnapping for ransom, knowingly negotiating to obtain a ransom. There are criminal gangs that have engaged in this behavior. We've recently seen the unfortunate consequence of one of these operations in East Trinidad. That is the reality of what we face. And it is the police service that is asking for this. And as senators and as legislators, you must ask your conscience, what could the possible downside be of assisting and providing this type of legislation to tackle the scourge of gang activity? You go on in this schedule: causing or inciting prostitution, controlling a child prostitute, causing or inciting a child to engage in sexual activity. Those three alone, tied into the criminal gangs that are engaged in transnational organized crime and human trafficking. And I can tell the country here today that the police service, our intelligence services, with the support of the defense force, are currently engaged in going after some of these criminal gangs that engaging currently in human trafficking across the border, bringing persons from Venezuela to Trinidad to engage them in prostitution. This gives them an additional tool in the fight against that criminal activity. You go on at 42 to 45, the keeping or management of a brothel, detention of persons in a brothel, prostitution, living on the earnings of prostitution, meeting a child following sexual grooming. Again, human trafficking elements where there are criminal gangs engaged across borders. This last one, forcible entry and forcible detainer under the Trespass Act. All of us who have certain housing developments in our constituencies are aware of it. We have constituents who come. I have it in East Port of Spain, places like the Harp in Sharford Court, other areas, St. Francois Valley Road, Madam President, where persons are forcefully ejected from their homes by criminal gangs. This allows the police now an extra tool in the fight against that criminal gang activity. You go to the part 3 of this bill, Madam President, which is now the powers of police officers. And previously, the police officers were given wider powers to tackle gang activity because of how they do their business. The police have dismantled in the last 2.5 years some very specific criminal gangs throughout Trinidad and Tobago. And when you get into an understanding of their operations, it is not how some people may think it is. With unsophisticated, just sitting down with a gun, drinking, liming, let's go down the road and commit an act. They are very sophisticated. They've started money laundering, purchase of properties, rental of areas, properties in areas, rental of cars, all these different types of schemes. When you start to study these criminal gangs, they break out, they diversify into other areas, illegal gambling, prostitution, human trafficking, narco-drug running. So the powers of the police now, under this bill, and I understood the debate and the Attorney General will address it later on, with dwelling houses and the entrance of dwelling houses, I understood the caution being laid. Previously, this also dealt with outside of dwelling houses. The detention of persons, Clause 16. There was a lot of debate on this Clause 16. Madam President, what I'd like to put on the record is this is a necessary provision in the tackling of criminal gang activity. Because what often happens is you may get intelligence of a certain gang operation going to take place. They're going to carry out a hit or they're going to conduct some criminal gang activity. And you intervene, the law enforcement officers intervene and hold them. In that exercise, without getting into the specifics, there is a lot of evidence to be gathered, but it takes time because of the type of technology, the type of interface that needs to be done, the type of interrogation of devices that needs to be done. That cannot be completed. When you start to build out the matrices of criminal gangs, who they're connected with, every time the law enforcement intervenes with persons engaged in criminal activity, they're then able to piece other parts of the puzzle together, but it takes time. So they've asked, and when you look at other anti-gang legislation around the world, they are allowed detention orders. And in this now, it's been reduced to the common law period that is accepted before a person is entitled either be charged or be let off, and that the police officers can go to a judicial officer. Is it that we no longer trust judicial officers for an ex parte order for further detention of up to 14 days? This has been used. It has been used successfully by law enforcement over the past few years whilst the legislation was in place, and it has prevented the occurrence of many issues of criminal gang activity.
Minister, your 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam President, sorry. Let me just answer some very specific comments that were made on the last time by Senator Mark. I listened to Senator Mark on the last occasion, read the Hansard, and he he began this conversation about SRPs. So I'd just like to correct the record here today. And he made specific reference to Section 6 of the Special Reserve Police Act. And as I was listening, it dawned on me, but I've heard this before. And I want to tell the country here today, as I'm seeing happen very, very frequently, persons standing up in the parliament, making certain arguments and points, but then it is already in or follows shortly after in a pre-action letter. So to put the country on notice that this legislation is now being looked at and challenged, and to have heard Senator Mark, first of all, I place on record here without fear of contradiction and challenge Senator Mark or anyone else to ask the Commissioner of Police, as a Minister of National Security, who is a minister under the SRP Act, given certain powers of direction, I have never, not once, never asked the Commissioner of Police to hire a single person as a Special Reserve Police. And under the legislation, it is only the Minister of National Security who has that power. Section 6 of the Act says, subject to the general order and directions of the Minister, that's the Minister of National Security. The Commissioner shall have the general command, and superintendents of Special Reserve Police shall be responsible to the Minister for efficient condition and for the proper carrying out of this Act. At no point in time, as Minister of National Security, has that taken place. There has been no abuse of power. Senator Mark also threw out, as they're famous for doing, 8,500 Special Reserve Police, that's the figure he has, is a private army, completely false. The Trinidad and Tobago SRP full-time force is 2,913 males, 864 females. Part-time, 357 males, 242 females. So that is under 4,000. So not even half of the figure being suggested. Very quickly, Senator Lachmidial, too many units in intelligence, the GIU, the OCNFB, SIU. The fact is these were all iterations. There now exists the SIU, Special Investigation Unit, and each division has an anti-gang unit, and they have been doing what they need to. This cry about resources, they're not being resourced, completely false. Yes, there may be difficulties in releases to the police service. It has not affected the efforts being aimed at the criminal gang activities. Evidence that the law is working. This is another red flag that is always thrown up. I never quite understood this. So they're saying, provide us with evidence, and this is the support for the sunset clause, that the law is working for us to support it. Isn't there a law against drinking and driving? People still do it. There's a law against littering. People still do it. There's a law not to use cell phones whilst driving. People still do it. So is it that you shouldn't have those laws in place because people are still going to break it? It's against the law to carry illegal firearms. People still do it. It's against the law to murder. People still do it. So that can never be a substantive argument for the non-passage of this anti-gang legislation. Every type of activity contemplated by this piece of legislation as gang-related activity is already an offense under the law, quote unquote. As I've said at the outset, that is completely false and misleading, and intentionally so, and rejected. Another dog whistle with respect to this. This is a holding bill. We hear it time and time again, to lock up people, and sometimes the introduction of race. Completely rejected. There is no holding bill here. As I've taken the time, Madam President, through you, to point out these offenses are specifically targeted at gang activity. The holding, you have to go to a court, to a judicial officer, and convince him or her up to a maximum of 14 days. And there is law that if that is done maliciously, you can get your damages, as was held with respect to the state of emergency in 2011. No piece of law solves crime, need to operationalize it and resources. The truth is, Madam President, it has been operationalized. Madam President, I see you're telling me to wrap up. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you as the President of the Senate and to the members of the Senate and commend this piece of legislation to you, the senators, because the reality is there is criminal gang activity, and this is absolutely necessary to fight the scourge of specific criminal gang activity. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Senator John